Welcome back, everybody. We are the Pinedo Brothers, the Pinedo Brothers podcast. I'm your host, Peter, and I have with me my brother,
Hey, I'm JP.
JP. Thank you very much for joining us. We're really glad that you're here with us watching, and I hope that you have a cold one or a little bit of whiskey like I do in this nice Thursday evening. Today, we're talking about something that all Catholics are very familiar with. And probably, we'll probably say all humans are pretty familiar with this feeling. We're talking about guilt. Um, it's something that we all share in common, we all experience, we all have an understanding of. But I think it's pretty safe to say that Catholics in particular, and Catholicism in particular, it has a reputation for guilt. And I think that's something that's worth exploring, trying to understand why we're known that for that, and if that's a good thing or a bad thing. What are your initial thoughts, JP?
Well, I think the one thing that's always occurred to me is that it seems like non-Catholics are more familiar with Catholic guilt than Catholics are, by and large. Uh, and that guilt, it really has a universal a universal place. Like, look at all of the kind of woke struggle sessions that we have these days, which are really just way of dealing with the fact that we're all fallen. So this is the Catholic guilt is maybe the best manifestation of dealing with guilt, in my opinion. And so maybe we can unpack that in this here podcast.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I think something that definitely sets us apart from the rest of the world, rest of society, and definitely as well as different types of Christians, different denominations of Christianity, Protestant denominations, is the practice of confession. I think that I'm not sure. Is that practiced by like Eastern Orthodox? Do you know?
I believe all the Orthodox have confession, yes,
Okay. Yeah.
just according to old Dostoevsky.
Yeah. So if you're not Catholic and you're listening, confession is when we as Catholics will go to a priest who we see as the representative of Christ here on earth in this capacity. He has been granted the powers by the church and in turn by Christ himself in the Bible to forgive sins. And so I think you can see it in multiple different ways. And really in my own life, I've kind of had a journey in understanding confession. Because I think you can definitely see confession as a beautiful time for healing. And I think that's what it's meant to be. A time to examine your conscience, examine yourself, your shortcomings and your failings, and be able to speak openly and honestly about yourself with God, and then to have all of those sins forgiven. And that's a wonderful and beautiful feeling. Um, but when I was a kid, I went through a period of my life that kind of maybe when I was a young teenager of being very terrified of confession. And I think it's kind of important to, take a look at confession and try to understand it as Catholics. And I think it also has a deep, um, I think you could definitely find a deep artistic significance in confession as well, because it's a very rich, deep, and not easily understood sacrament. What do you think?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I mean, what was it? I think it was either Freud or Jung or one of those great psychoanalysts. I said it like a Texan right there, psychoanalyst. One of those great psychoanalysts out there that said if the whole world had confession, then there wouldn't be any psychoanalysts. So
Mm.
Catholics are really onto something when it comes to confession and um, the human condition to realize that we are not up to snuff and that we fall short of the ideal takes a great constructive face in this sacrament. That's of course imparted by Christ. It's not just something that, you know, man figured out on its own. We have, you know, he who built the church to thank for it. But it is a beautiful thing, like you were saying. It's not an easy thing. It's very difficult, very uncomfortable, but it's different. But it's worthwhile.
Mm, mhm. Yeah. Have you I mean, I'm wondering if you've kinda had a similar journey at all in being able to reach a better understanding of confession. Because I think when I was younger, I never saw it so much as a bad thing, but it was a scary thing in that um, it requires a lot of honesty with yourself and really examining what your shortcomings are, and then to be able to go to someone and uh, to tell them those shortcomings. That's pretty scary, and I think it was definitely scary for me as a kid. Um, what do you think about that?
Well, I my personal experience with confession, the sacrament of confession, um, is not. I mean, there's always times where it's difficult. Like you get a priest in a bad mood, and it's going to be difficult. um, and I think any Catholic that's gone to confession enough has horror stories about a bad confession. Because we're still, even though we believe that we're confessing our sins not to a man but to God, and then the persona Christi, the person of Christ, is embodied by this priest. So we're confessing to God, but the form, every sacrament must take some form, at least according to Catholic doctrine. Um, the form of it is to say the words, part of the form, to that priest that embodies Christ, or that steps in for Christ here on earth, um, which is a very wise thing to do. It's much more difficult, and you have to come to grips with how sinful you are much more realistically if you're speaking to a person, to a man, and that man can often be just as fallen as you are. And so it can get a little awkward, it can get a little, you know, uncomfortable. And
Yeah.
so I've had times like that. I think in the beginning, it was when I first started out as confession, it wasn't too difficult. I think maybe you or our other brother Joseph had more um, problems with scruples. So that's the Catholic term for where you are just so overly concerned about, let me say this in the right way, or am I confessing everything that I have to confess? I know Joseph had that. I don't know about you. That it becomes like a great trial to go to confession. I definitely had times where I was sitting in the confession line, just like on pins and needles, like I am not looking forward to this. Um, but it wasn't a quite, I think, the burden that I've seen with others that where it's really scrupulous.
Mhm.
Um, so I don't think, and it always has occurred to me that after I've gone to confession, I've been able to be, um, I've been able to be a better person. I've noticed that it becomes more possible, and that when I'm falling into particular temptations, it's generally coincides with times where I've lapsed a little bit with confession. So it has occurred to me that from a very young age it was helpful, and then
Mhm.
even though it was not convenient and kind of difficult, it didn't strike me as something that was impossible to do.
Mhm.
Anyway, is that too much of a cop out?
No, not at all. It's making me think that if kind of in this mode of talking about the effect of something like confession and the effect of, Catholic guilt of what it has on you. I think that if we're talking about Catholic guilt, and we'll get to a chance to talk about it in different contexts besides confession in a second. But in the context of confession, I think that um, it it's a wonderful, um, I think, one, motivator, and two, inspirer of really true greatness. If you just look at the saints like Saint Augustine, his book, The Confessions, he takes his he goes back to the very beginning as a child and just lays bare all of the wrongdoing that he's done throughout his entire life, and it's an inspiring and moving story. um, and so I think that kind of what you were saying just a second ago really struck a chord with me. The fact that if everyone had confession, that we wouldn't have what did you say? This all these psychoanalysts.
Psychoanalysts.
Yeah,
Mhm.
you know, I wouldn't go so far to say as we wouldn't have any because obviously some people might need it, but I think that um, examining your conscience and then being forced to summon the courage to be able to uh, confess to the wrongdoing that you've done. It's not just meant to make you uncomfortable. I don't think the church institutes this, or God institutes this to make us uncomfortable. It's also meant to call us out into greatness, I would say, um, because there is the first step into of becoming great and of becoming striving for greatness and for perfection comes from understanding and analyzing your shortcomings. And I think it's pretty plain that the human condition, if we are not forced to um, really take a look at ourselves and examine our conscience, and then even further than that, to confess to them, to our shortcomings, then we're not really going to do it. And so I think that it's a um, an awesome way to actually be able to respond to the call for greatness. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Absolutely, it does. I think, yeah, I came at it from the very beginning where we're talking about how we all know that we're subpar in some way, that we're fallen in some way, that we're not up to snuff. And um, the more you hide it, the more it's going to manifest in some way. And the more you face it, the more you're capable of overcoming it. And that's that kind of that greatness. But just from that very basic instinct, like, no, I'm fallen, and then admitting to it very publicly, well, not publicly, but to someone else, you know, it's it really makes you face where you're at. Um,
Hmm.
it's never like a perfect. I wouldn't want anyone to expect going into confession as being some huge cathartic moment. At least that's not my experience. But it is moments which allow you to build into something better than you are now, um, if you continue with them on a routine. And so, yeah, I like that idea of saying, okay, if you want to be something great, consider confession. I would say if you want to be something that actually has a realistic view of who you are and your place in the universe, which is kind of crucial right now with our loss of meaning, consider confession. So it works on a lot of different levels.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. Yeah. And so I think kind of approaching it from a different perspective here, though. Um, let's talk about the problem of evil,
Yeah.
which is something that's always very much on the mind of people, I think, especially who are considering Catholicism or even considering Christianity or just considering the existence of God. The classic problem is that, well, what about evil? Why? How can a all-knowing, all-loving God allow for there to be pain and suffering? Um, there's a lot of theological responses, philosophical responses to that, but I want to approach from a different perspective in the context of guilt. Um, and this is a question that I've always really pondered myself. How can um, how can there be an all-loving, all-powerful, um, intimately caring God, and at the same time, how does that God then have the ability to condemn us to hell. You know, I see that as it's a crazy thing to think about. Do you have any initial responses or any initial reactions to that?
Yes, but I want to make sure I'm following the thread well. Can you lay out how this is connected to confession? How do you make this jump so that what's your perspective when you jump into this point of view or to this
Mhm.
line of questioning?
Yeah, so well, of course it's all tied in to sin, and that's what confession is about. It's examining your conscience, finding how you've sinned, and owning up to that. Um, but taking a step back from that, we're we have a Catholic understanding of having a kind of inherently sinful nature, as it is inheriting it from Adam and Eve, the first humans, as being stained with original sin. And we're taught that baptism washes us clean, but we still have this concupiscence, this draw towards evil, towards disorder. Um, I think there's a lot of different ways you can try to approach that and try to understand that. But at the end of the day, it's that draw towards evil, that sinful nature that draws us that oftentimes ends up making us choose the sin, choosing disorder. And if we die with that grave disorder on our hearts, um, then our understanding is that we go to hell, which is really, really difficult to swallow. And I think maybe you can pick apart a little bit of what I was saying there, because I'm just kind of presenting the problem, and I have kind of some of my own ideas about it as well. But I want to hear your thoughts, and I know this is something that, as an artist, I've really tried to imbue into my work, definitely into the Unfollowed, into the other things that I've written. Is this idea of guilt, and how it's inherent, it's deeply embedded into the human condition, and how it's almost a tragic tale, a human tragedy, that we have this concupiscence and this draw towards disorder. Um, and so the question is, how can we have this that's part of us, something inherited that's not part of our decision, our choice, and still have a loving and all powerful God?
Sure. So if I was going to boil it down, or the connection to confession is, how is it that God makes it possible? God created us. If God created us, how is it that He created us so that we are of the sort that are constantly needing to go to confession, right? That kind of the connection there.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that the first case or the first response I have to that is, well, can you picture yourself um, without this fallen nature, like this perfect being that never has any inclination to go to sin? Um, I can definitely think of a version of me which chose not to follow that inclination. But I can't think of a version of me that doesn't have the inclination without thinking of myself as some sort of machine. Does that make sense? I
Mhm.
If you were always and forever inclined to do exactly what you should do, like the way you were programmed to do, like operate like a perfect robot, it doesn't seem very human to me. So like our very concept of being human seems to connect with some sort of struggle. I'm not saying that
Mhm.
to be human necessarily means you are in need of confession all the time, but to be human seems to mean that you are not some robot that does exactly what you should do, knows exactly what you should do, and then executes it,
Hmm.
like a programmed robot. So, is there a version of ourselves that we can even imagine that has that kind of perfect nature? Because I can't.
Hmm. Well, I think that I really liked what you said there about the human condition being in kind of in a way tied into struggle. And I think that's definitely what has been proven to be true throughout the ages, and what has been elevated further by Christ himself when he came onto earth. I mean, he didn't come as in the perfect conditions or the perfect or have the perfect life. Um, he was executed, and that's definitely a struggle. um, and so I think that in part kind of responds to that problem, in that we're not meant to be automatons. We're not meant to not have to struggle, because in struggle we find within ourselves something greater than we would have not if we didn't struggle. If that makes sense. Um, so I think that's really good. That's a good response. It's a good start. I personally, when I've kind of, I don't know how deep into the weeds we want to get here, but I know that it can be a very unsatisfying answer to say that freedom is the reason for suffering, you know um because you can, I think, to me at least, it's very easy to imagine, oh, the first humans didn't sin, so we don't have that stain of original sin, and we're like them in that we don't have this constant draw towards disorder. Um, but at the same time, too, it's I think a Catholic response would be, you form your conscience, right? You form your ability to resist evil through practice, just like any other thing, just like working out, going to the gym, or practicing at a sport that you play, or practicing anything. You get better at it with time. Um, so that's definitely one response to that. But yeah, I think that it's a frustrating question for a lot of people, and I think that is something that is definitely missed in a lot of Christian and Catholic modern art. Wouldn't you say?
The struggle or the frustration
I
at
think
the
both.
answer.
The frustration and struggle of what it is to wrestle with those questions. That's
Okay.
not. I think that's something that's not often portrayed.
Yeah, I could see that with modern modern Christian art. Absolutely. Um, Although at the same time, you could do it. I've seen it done really wrong as well. Like it's the whole screaming "why" on the beach, dropping to your knees, shouting at the ocean sort of trope. Um, that's been done. So it's like it can be done, but it hasn't been done maybe with the nuance that we're talking about right now. At
Hmm.
least recently. Obviously, everything's been done very well at some point.
Hmm.
Um, the thing I was trying to get at though was something a little bit different. Not exactly freedom. Like I think if you were going to boil down to why is it that we have a sinful nature, I would say, or not a sinful nature, but why is it that we have a nature that is inclined to miss the mark? Or I would say even something less black and white than that. Why do we have a nature that is capable of missing the mark? Maybe not inclined even, but capable. It wouldn't be freedom; it would be love, if you're going to boil it down to a word, because you can only fall in love with someone if you have the option to not. Otherwise, it's not love. It's slavery of some sort. If you can only choose one option, it's not a choice, right? So if you want to actually have this thing, this characteristic, which requires choice, then you must be able to throw it away as well. So, in order for us to have the gift of being able to love Christ, actually love Him as we understand it, then we have to be able to not.
Mm,
Um,
mhm,
so, yeah, freedom is a part of that, but I think freedom is tangential to the ability to love. Um, like, freedom is a means to get to an end, but if you present the means, it's dissatisfying, at least to me.
mm,
Um, but what I was trying to stay very, very specifically is I'm not sure it's helpful to us to um, when I pose the question to you. What I was trying to say when I posed the question to you, can you imagine yourself without that inclination to sin? I'm not sure it's helpful to us, and I'm great. I'd be grateful if people commenting or you correcting me for us to be um, ungrateful for us to be how we are. Now, I do think we can, um, because okay, before I go on off to another tangent, the reason why I say that is because it's like um, that obnoxious person, that obnoxious child that gets a great gift and then is like, why didn't I get this other gift? You know, it's like, okay, you're here, you're not perfect, and maybe you can imagine yourself better, but then why why question the gift of you right now? It doesn't seem helpful to me. Let's work with what you got. But then what you said, which really interested me, is you said, well, you spoke about Christ to my answer. Can you imagine yourself without this concupiscence? And well, Christ didn't have that according to Catholic doctrine, at least. He didn't have concupiscence, but he did struggle. Like you said, he did struggle. So can we imagine ourselves like Christ? Well, that would be difficult. Christ is hard to imagine just, you know, just by himself, capital H. Imagining us like Christ, like exactly with his perfect divine nature, difficult. I can see trying to follow him better. I don't know. So you kind of answered a question in a way I'm not quite too sure how to answer, um, but I find it very interesting. Something I'll have to ponder a bit. What do you
mm.
make of all that?
It's difficult. It's a lot to grasp for sure. Um, Again, I always kind of come back to when I think these questions, when we're asking these types of questions, um, I'm oftentimes just kind of going back to idea of it's a super like cheesy Christian idea of like Jesus is the answer to everything, you know? Like what's two plus two, Timmy? Jesus. Good job. You got it.
You got it
Um,
right.
um, but in this context, I think that does have a lot of truth to it, and that is, I think Christ is the key to understanding a lot of these questions. Um, because again, like he had a perfect, or he has a perfect nature, totally human, totally divine, um, and yet he did struggle, and he had that full human experience, except for that intrinsic topic that we're talking about right here, and that's guilt.
Mm,
Um, because he didn't sin, he did not have any stain of sin on him. Um, but yet we are made in the image and likeness of God. And so even with this guilt, we still have that divine spark inside of us. And I think that in many ways, life can kind of be seen, at least for many people, and I think you could account Augustine as one of them. Life can be seen as the battle between the spark of the divine trying to and the darkness of guilt trying to smother that divine spark, because people look at Catholicism and Christianity and see it as, oh, those people are, always feeling guilty, and they have all this whole set of rules that if they don't follow, then they have to go to confession, and they're feeling, just feeling down on themselves all the time. But that's not the truth. I think that's a misunderstanding of guilt, in that guilt in the Catholic understanding is a call to not let the darkness smother out that divine spark in you. Um, so guilt can be a terrible, awful um, dictator, and it can smother you to death. It can cause suicide. And so, in that sense, in that understanding of guilt, that is something that we must definitely not portray Catholicism anyway associated with that. But guilt in the terms of understanding how you have shortcomings and being able to own up to them, and um, by the grace of God, become something better. That is the kind of guilt that I think we should be pushing. What do you think?
Absolutely. Well, I think that is a very important distinction to be made. I think it's actually the distinction that really divides not all Protestants, but a lot of Protestants and Catholics. Um, Starting from Luther himself, his understanding of guilt was that it's unsurmountable. Unsurmountable. Like you, no matter what you do, you're not capable of overcoming that to a heroic degree. Um, so it makes sense. There's no reason to go to confession if you're not capable of overcoming it. So that's why you jettison it. However, if you see it as a call to do and follow Christ with your actions more closely, I think the faith without actions is dead, as St. Paul says. Um, if that call resonates through your experience with guilt, then I think you're on the right track. The way that I see the church really is giving us a very human path towards Christ, towards perfection. Peterson would say in the optimal way, the optimal path. So these practices, these symbols, these sacraments that the church gives us allow us to cope with our nature, such as it is. It's the church is really good in not saying, as a Marxist might say, or Nietzsche might say, those that can't be taught to fly must be taught to fall faster, or the survival of the fittest. The church has always found humans to be lacking and then said, well, here's how these lacking humans can actually make something of themselves. Obviously, the church hierarchy is not perfect. And so the church has not followed, especially the hierarchy, has not followed that sort of maxim perfectly. But Christ is perfect. And since he built the church, you can see that idea of finding us where we're at. It's the whole idea of when the burning bush, um, that big moment when God revealed himself to Moses. He didn't have to do that. He didn't have to say, remove your sandals for your unholy ground. He could have just burned up Moses's feet, or he could have removed Moses's feet for him, or sandals for him. But he set a law, set a practice, which would allow Moses to be able to understand how he should relate with God, relate with the divine. And so the church is really God continuing to bend down, just like God was bending down to Moses, to us all at the burning bush. The church is God continuing to bend down.
Mm.
And then you see the church's way of dealing with this guilt that's inherent in all of us that we're not going to shake no matter what. There's Luther's way, there's the woke leftist way. It's not going to go away no matter what. But if we use it constructively, we can really start to see something great being formed inside ourselves. So I like that. I like your distinction there.
Yeah. I mean, I
I
think,
want to go back though. Go ahead.
well, I mean, you're really just making me think of the true artistry of the church, as instituted and guided by God. The sacraments are the most, I think, artistic aspect of the church. You think of the church, you think of the church buildings, which often can be extremely beautiful and moving and inspiring. But nothing is more inspiring, beautiful, and moving than the sacraments, which make up the entire life of the church itself. Um, like confession, the symbology, the physicality of it, the as well as the truly effective nature of it, is communicating God's love to us in a way that we can truly experience as humans, to see, feel, and touch them. Besides reading the Bible, I'm not bashing reading the Bible. I think Christians need to read the Bible, but without those sacraments, we would have that incomplete experience. And I think that as that's central to the human condition, and it's central to art to be able to portray an experience, or that have present something that people can experience and become part of. And that's what the sacraments do for Catholics.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I like that. Yeah, the symbolism of the sacraments are a rich artistic source that we need to draw from as Catholic artists. But I wanted to go back a little bit. What you asked a question. So how could God, a loving God, condemn someone to hell? And I think I answered the first part of the question, like how can God create us to sin? Not to sin. How could God create us capable of sinning? I think was what I focused on. But I think you took it a little bit further. We're saying, okay, how could he create us capable of sinning? And then how could he judge us as meriting hell, right? Was that like the second part of that question? And I don't think we got to that part.
Hmm.
Is that right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, my initial reaction, the way I've understood hell, is that it's that concept of time. Remember the concept of time that we spoke about here at the beginning of the year, 9 months ago, where God and the angels have no past or present because they're timeless. I mean, they have no past or no future because they're timeless. They only have the eternal present. They don't experience this decay, which is really how we measure time, is through a decay of our bodies, decay of our universe. As long as we're winding down is the point. We measure that winding down. So because we have that decay, we have points of change, where you make one decision then, which dictates your interior life, dictates who you are as a person. It speaks to it's an action is like a word saying this is what I believe, this is who I stand for, it's either non-serviam basically, like the devil, or serviam, like I choose to follow you, love or not is the way I put it in the extrovert. But we can change our answer because we have these different moments of time. Um, the devil can't, because he's always saying the same thing, because he's always in the right now. So if he decides one thing, it's the same forever. However, if we live our life consistently, consistently, and in the end, unrepentantly saying non serviam, we're not going to be able to change our mind forever. In the end, Catholic doctrine is that we experience time more like the angels after we die, more like spirits where we experience eternity. And so, in the absence, so that's to say we don't experience time. So, in the absence of time, I don't understand how you could possibly square changing your mind, just like you can't square the devil changing his mind. So, how could God condemn someone to hell? Not, how could God overwrite someone's desire to not serve, to not be with God? I think the understanding of hell is, at least from my point of view, the understanding of hell is that it's constantly telling God non serviam and God mercifully saying, okay, I created you to be able to do this, to reject me because I want you to love me. And so, therefore, in order to love, I must allow you to reject. So, honoring that decision forever and always because we're incapable of changing our mind. If we no longer see decay and live like angels, spirits without bodies, and we're constantly rejecting God, then we have to have some sort of space that resides where God allows us to reject him. And that's hell. It seems it seems kind of simple, I suppose, but there's a lot of artistic ways that you can picture that, like Dante, or like we tried to do in The Extrovert, or pictured like in the uh, the Godfather. The end of Godfather Part Two is a good picture of hell. So um, that's a lot of words, though. What do you think?
Man, well, um, it is I think one of the responses that you could first off, and I think it's a beautiful understanding, and I think that it's a great way to see it. Um, it does make me think a little bit that either I'm either there's something more to that answer, or we have a really deep misunderstanding in the church of hell, um, which I think is definitely possible. Um, I think. Can you hear me?
Cut off a bit.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. Well, as I was saying, um, we used to always hear that at least I used to always hear that tons and tons of people were not were going to hell. A ton of people were choosing evil freely, and so that means they're in the end will suffer the consequences of that. And that can make sense. However, under I think that under this understanding of hell, what you just kind of laid out there, um, that doesn't really hold up because most of the people, I would say many, um, at least many of them, are not choosing to do evil or wrong, um, because they don't want to serve, or because they're not doing it consciously rejecting God, if that makes sense. And then there's people who a more narrow set of people who are Catholics and who struggle with guilt. And what if they die in a state of mortal sin? have they chosen to reject God? So I think this very black and white, like, understanding of mortal sin and saying yes and no, it gets really hazy to me, I think, um when we're saying it's because they're choosing to go to hell. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Well, I don't think that you can. I don't think that you can. Um, okay, maybe murder, but it's difficult to paint a mortal sin in black and white. From I think that that is a dangerous thing to do, especially if you're an artist. An artist needs to deal with sin. He's supposed to deal truthfully with the world, and there's a lot of sin in this world. But if you paint so, oh, well, this is saying no to God, irrefutably. If you paint that into your script or to your story or to your whatever it is, it's going to limit your art. It's not going to make for a very interesting story. So I do think mortal sin is that idea. Well, I guess to explain mortal sin would be what I just laid out, which is you saying to God, "I would no longer wish to have a relationship with you." Um, but I do think that those that are in a state of mortal sin, at least initially, have some knowledge of it. I do think that there is a sense of not wanting to be in the presence of God, not wanting to be in the area, like close to a church, not wanting to say something that, not wanting to speak to God in prayer. There's maybe it's not a malicious, but a constant desire to run away.
Hmm.
I think that's pretty common. And I do think that is if you always decide to run away and you end your life deciding to run away, you're not going to be dying like screaming like some demon probably, but you're probably not going to be able to change your mind if that's how you live.
Hmm.
So I think you're right though. I think that we have to be cautious. I don't think that it's a good idea, the standard operating procedure, to condemn anyone to hell or to death for that matter, but I guess there are some instances where, for the safety of the vulnerable, but to hell, definitely not. Um, so, especially as artists, but that's a
Hmm.
long roundabout way to reply.
Well, I think that we mostly agree on that there. um I think that that is something that as we move into the next generation of the church, need to be very aware and conscious of. I think just as a lot of very woke crowds will write off, half the population as evil, racist, and homophobic. Um, I don't. I think the church makes a similar mistake if they write off half the people as all going to hell. You know, it's something that, yes, we cannot, as a church, we must continue to say right is right and wrong is wrong. We can't blur the lines of what is right and wrong, but we need to be communicating, I think, a more complete understanding of what guilt is and of what sin means and what it means to go to hell. That understanding of saying it's not so much God saying, you got an 89, but you needed a 90 to get in. Sorry, you're going to suffer forever. That's an understanding that I think is very common, and that's something that's perpetuated, I think, by Catholic schools and a lot of Catholic groups.
Really?
Um,
Hmm.
yeah, yeah. From I know I went to a Catholic university, Franciscan, and Franciscan's great. It's really solid. but a lot of those people came from Catholic high schools and Catholic middle schools and things like that. And what is being communicated there, I think, really pushes people away from the church, um, because oftentimes you're getting that understanding of like, um, oh, everyone's going to hell, you know? And I see that as, like I said, very similar to the woke, like everyone's racist. Um, Communicating the deeper understanding of it's choosing evil and choosing to reject God, and so you choosing to condemn in a way yourself, and God mercifully allowing that to occur is a much better understanding than saying that you didn't pass the test. Um, but to me, I think it's important to understand, just as guilt is a calling to rise out of our sinfulness and to strive for perfection. So also we should understand, be understanding of how people do struggle with guilt, and they do have this understanding of the church as condemning so many people to hell. I think it's really dangerous for people to have that understanding, and it's something that we can strive to, especially through art, to communicate better.
Hmm. Okay. Well, I haven't had that experience myself of the church being particularly guilty of that mentality, condemning people to hell. But I am completely sure that um, what you say is 100% accurate, that there's that propensity out there. So, yeah, it's definitely not a good idea. And it's also not helpful. Like just from a purely, if you're going to build something great, it's not helpful to be thinking of that. It's also not helpful if you're going to try to get to heaven yourself. So, just from a very practical standpoint, probably best to avoid that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We
Yeah.
probably ought to start wrapping it up, though. Did you have final thoughts on any of this?
Yeah. Well, I think that we discussed that at length, and so I'm really grateful for that awesome conversation. But I did want to have a quick little take on, just another cultural trend, something kind of artistic, just mostly culturally relevant, that's been going around on social media. I don't know if you've heard of it. The trend about girlfriends and wives asking their husbands and boyfriends, "How often do you think about the Roman Empire?"
Right.
Fascinating little trend there. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, yeah. Michelle asked me about it.
And I've seen a lot of great responses, and a lot of them are jokes, I think, but it is really, I think, hilarious and also telling to see how often men will think about the Roman Empire, which is something that you wouldn't think of as relevant at all because it was what 2,000 years ago, and is it's just not in existence in any way today, except you realize actually in many ways it is. And I think the most telling thing and why I think it's kind of important and relevant is that it's showing that men, which have men masculinity has been attacked and demasculinized so much in culture, um, look to something that they see as kind of the epitome of masculinity, the epitome of greatness. I think the one word people think of when they think of the Roman Empire is, is great, majestic,
The
the great
glory
Roman
of
Empire.
Rome.
Right. And I think that it's really telling that men think about it a lot because that just talks to the human, to the nature of man, of what it is to be a man, and that you are called to greatness, and you have this urge to go out and do great things, great deeds. And obviously, in our modern society, that has a different context, that takes different shape and form than probably going and building empires and slaying dragons, but as I think Peterson would probably say, we do build empires and slay dragons in a way of its own. And and so I think that's just showing um, that call to greatness that all men hear. What do you think?
Absolutely. I love that. I think that you are exactly right. We're speaking to our nature when we think about something like Rome. We're saying something that's about the essence of, maybe I wouldn't say manhood, but the desire to be a man, which is inside all of us men. So I think, and I used that was probably not a great sentence. Let me restate it. It's the desire to be the virtuous man, which is different from being a virtuous woman. The distinct characteristics of femininity and masculinity are revealed when you ask that question. How often do you think about the Roman Empire? Um, I always think about wanting to build things too. I want to build things all the time. That's kind of our shtick as men, is being builders. Um, and so when we look at something as great as the Roman Empire that was built, it's impressive. And there's other examples too. I liked how Matt Walsh pointed out. I don't think about the Roman Empire nearly as much as I think about Cortez and the conquest of the Aztecs, which is probably one of the favorite podcasts that we've done. Check it out if you haven't seen it, because yeah, that guy. I probably think of Cortez more than I think of the Roman Empire as well. But yeah, we aspire to be like great men that have come before us. We look to role models. It's very common. It makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think that's probably going to about wrap it up for us today. Thanks for joining, everyone. And we're very happy to have you with us. We're the Pinedo Brothers. And thanks, JP. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Pete.
Hmm.